Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens when someone decides to cross the line between the natural and the supernatural? Have you ever wondered about the price of invoking forces that many don't even believe exist? The truth is that there are dark spiritual territories, depths that most people would never dare explore. And I've been there. I've been in an abyss where the shadows are thicker than any darkness you can imagine, and what I'm going to share today are revelations from hell that will shake you in ways neither story has. Imagine a place where there is no hope, where screams of despair echo amid eternal flames. A place where souls cry out for mercy but are swallowed by darkness. It looks like a scene from a horror movie, doesn't it? But believe me, there is nothing fictional about it. Hell is real, and many are heading towards it without realizing it. I know this because one day I walked this path myself. Seduced by curiosity and the false promise of power, I delved into occult practices that promised answers but actually opened doors to spiritual torment that nearly destroyed my soul. Have you ever heard of spiritual traps? They do not come with warning signs. They have no obvious signs. They disguise themselves as harmless, even attractive things. A seance, a seemingly harmless ritual, or even a search for self-knowledge through alternative methods. But what no one tells you is that by entering this territory, you not only risk losing your peace, you risk losing your soul. What happened to me is living proof that playing with the unknown has consequences, and they are much more real and terrifying than anyone can imagine. At that time, I believed I was in control. I thought the forces I invoked were at my command. But nothing could be further from the truth. What I didn't know is that when you invoke something supernatural, you are not dealing with neutral or benevolent forces. It's opening doors to hell, literally. It was at that moment that I had the scariest experience of my life. I was confronted by dark entities, by demons that seemed to feed on my fear and despair. They whispered lies, planted doubts, and wrapped me in a web of darkness that seemed impossible to escape. What if I told you that many of the choices you make today could be taking you down the same path? What practices that seem harmless, such as seeking answers from the supernatural, can actually be open doors to eternal damnation? I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to open your eyes. Hell is not just a place where souls go after death. He can start now with the wrong decisions, with the shortcuts that promise happiness but lead to torment. This journey is not just mine. It's something that many face without even knowing it. Perhaps you yourself have felt a strange presence, an emptiness you can't explain, or a spiritual weight that seems overwhelming. This is no coincidence. There are forces working against you, forces that want to drag you into the abyss. And the only way to free yourself is to understand what is really happening in this spiritual world that many prefer to ignore. Today, I will open that door for you, not to take you into darkness, but to let you see the reality of what is happening on the other side. I will share the revelations I received, the torments I witnessed, and the truths that changed my life forever. Hell is real, and its traps are closer than you think. And now the choice is yours. Are you willing to discover the truth that can change the destiny of your soul? If everything you've heard so far has awakened something in your heart, be it curiosity, fear, or even spiritual restlessness, know that this is not by chance. We are not just dealing with stories, but with spiritual realities that impact lives, choices, and eternal destinies. That's why I want to make a very special invitation to you. Leave your prayer request here in the comments. Whatever weight you carry, whatever struggle you face, do not underestimate the power of prayer. Prayer is our most powerful weapon against darkness. It is our direct channel with God, a light that cuts through any darkness. When we unite in prayer, we move spiritual mountains and break chains that try to bind us. Then, write your request. Let's pray together, because no one needs to face this battle alone. You are not alone. And if this content touched you, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps the message reach more people who also need to hear this liberating truth. Also, activate the bell so you don't miss the next revelations. We're just beginning this journey, and I want you to be here with me every step of the way. Together, through prayer and the search for spiritual answers, we can find true liberation and clarity for our lives. So right now, leave your request in the comments. Let's pray for you. I used to believe that life could be controlled by the simplest choices: where to work, who to relate to, which paths to follow. Everything seemed logical and under my command. But deep down, there was a void that no decision seemed to fill. I constantly wondered if life had a greater purpose, if there was something beyond what my eyes could see. This desire for answers, for something that transcended the monotony of routine, was what led me to explore a territory that I would never have imagined would be so dangerous. At first, it seemed like just curiosity, something harmless. But looking back, I see how every step of this journey was paved by small choices that took me to dark spiritual places and ultimately what I can only describe as an abyss of terror. At that time, I didn't know the risks. How could I? Everything seemed so attractive, so full of promise. A friend casually mentioned that she was trying out a few different spiritual practices: card reading, guided mantra meditation, and even rituals to attract good energy. She spoke with enthusiasm, as if she had discovered a secret of the universe. And it was with this same excitement that I started taking the first steps on this journey. I clearly remember the first time I came into contact with something considered occult. It was a tarot reading. The woman doing the reading seemed to have answers to everything: about my future, about my doubts, and even about things that no one else knew. That fascinated me. How could anyone know so much just by turning over cards? I felt a mix of curiosity and distrust, but something was pulling me to continue. Over time, this fascination began to grow. It wasn't just about the tarot. I started attending meetings and groups that discussed deeper spiritual topics. They talked about energies, vibrations, universal forces that could be manipulated for our benefit. At the time, this seemed logical. Who wouldn't want to shape their own destiny? But there was something strange that I couldn't identify right away. A feeling that something was out of place, as if each ritual or practice was pulling me deeper into an invisible well. But at the same time, the enchantment was too strong to simply ignore. I convinced myself that this was all part of the process of self-knowledge, that it was necessary to dive deep to find answers. The problem is, the deeper I dived, the more lost I became. I started having recurring nightmares, dreams that seemed so real that when I woke up, I still felt the weight of what I'd experienced in my sleep. In dreams, I was often pursued by faceless shadows, beings that whispered things I couldn't understand. I woke up sweating, with the feeling that something was in my room. But I told myself that they were just projections from my subconscious, perhaps a reflection of the fear I still felt about entering an unknown world. I didn't want to believe that it could be something more. It was during this period that I began to notice changes in my daily life. Little things at the beginning, objects that seemed to move around on their own, electronic devices that turned in and off without explanation. But over time, the signs became clearer and impossible to ignore. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention, or perhaps warn me that I was on a dangerous path. But instead of stopping, I continued. The more these signs increased, the more I became convinced that I needed to go further. After all, it couldn't all be a coincidence. I felt like I was close to discovering something great, something that would change my life forever. However, what I didn't know was that every step I took along this path was leading me into a trap. A spiritual trap so well disguised that I would never have imagined what I was about to face. I noticed that some people around me were starting to move away. Friendships that once seemed solid began to fall apart. My family began to notice changes in my behavior. I was becoming more reserved, more irritable, and sometimes I felt an inexplicable need to be alone. All of this I attributed to the transformation process I thought I was going through. I couldn't see that these were the consequences of opening spiritual doors that should never have been opened. When I think about this beginning of my journey, what strikes me most is how everything seemed so harmless. Nothing I did felt wrong or dangerous. People around me encouraged me, told me that I was on the right path, that self-knowledge was liberating. I believed that. I believed I was searching for answers, but in reality, I was losing myself. If there had been someone who could have warned me back then, maybe things would have been different. maybe I could have avoided what was coming. And now, as I share this with you, I want you to reflect too. Have you ever felt that something seemingly harmless started to take up more space in your life? Have you ever experienced situations where it seemed like you were being carried by a force you couldn't explain? We want to know if you've ever been through something like this. If so, share it in the comments, even if it's something small. Write, "I felt this," or "I recognize this feeling." Let's talk about this because sometimes the first step to understanding what's going on is recognizing that something needs to be said. From the moment I began to delve deeper into this apparently fascinating universe, things began to change. But not in an obvious way. At first, it all seemed very seductive, a promise of control, of knowledge, of a privileged view of the world and even of myself. I remember a simple ritual I did early on. I was told it would be something to attract positive energy. The environment had soft music in the background, scented candles, and almost mesmerizing words were repeated like mantras. There was nothing overt or overtly scary, but something happened. At that moment, I felt as if an invisible door had been opened. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the first step towards something I would never be able to control. The changes were subtle, like a fog that spreads slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you are completely enveloped in it. I began to feel a kind of constant restlessness, as if something was always lurking, watching. Still, I insisted on continuing. The promise of spiritual awakening was too tempting to give up. And the deeper I went, the more it seemed like a different, almost palpable energy was approaching me. They told me that this was normal, that it was part of the process. But what if it wasn't? What if these energies were actually something much more dangerous than I could imagine? Dreams that were once just uncomfortable began to take on a darker tone. I began to dream of places I had never seen before. Dark forests, deep caves, corridors that seemed endless and full of shadows. In many of these dreams, I was called by a voice that I couldn't identify, but that sounded seductive and threatening at the same time. This voice told me that I was on the right path, that I needed to go deeper. And for some reason, I believed it. It was as if that force knew exactly what I wanted to hear. There was one night in particular that I will never forget. I was in a group that practiced a ritual of connection with spirit guides. They said that these guides were protectors, beings of light, and that they were there to help us. During the ritual, a strange feeling began to come over me. It was as if the air around me was heavier. My eyes were closed, but I could feel something moving around the room. When I opened my eyes, I saw shadows cast on the walls, but there was nothing there to justify them. I didn't mention it to anyone, but at that moment, I realized something was wrong. I should have stopped there, but I didn't stop. After that night, the demonstrations became more evident. Objects in my house would start falling without explanation, lights would flicker, and I often had the feeling that someone was watching me. The strangest thing is that, instead of pushing me away, it aroused my curiosity even more. It was as if I was being pulled by an irresistible force, a spiritual magnet that was taking me deeper and deeper. I started spending hours studying the occult, trying to understand what was happening to me, but the more I looked, the more I became entangled in it. It was during one of these searches that I came across something that left a deep impression on me. One text talked about the spiritual consequences of opening doors to the supernatural. He described in detail what many people experienced after becoming involved in occult practices: night torments, spiritual persecutions, and in some cases, even possessions. As I read, I felt a mixture of disbelief and identification. Each line seemed to describe exactly what I was going through. I should have listened to the warning, but I convinced myself that I was different, that I was in control, that none of this could affect me if I didn't allow it. The scariest thing, however, is that I began to realize that I was not only being watched, but also being manipulated. Small decisions that were once clear and rational began to become confusing. It was as if my mind was invaded by thoughts that weren't mine, ideas that led me to act in ways I never would have acted before. I remember a day when, for no apparent reason, I felt an overwhelming need to light candles and recite words that I barely understood. Later, I realized that these words were part of an invocation ritual. I didn't even know what I was doing, but I seemed to be guided by an invisible force that took control of my will. I know that, for many, this may seem exaggerated or even a figment of the imagination, but I assure you it's not. The presence I felt was as real as anyone around me. It wasn't just a feeling, it was almost like it was physical, palpable. And with each passing day, it became stronger, more invasive. At night, I could barely sleep. Fear took over me, but at the same time, there was a part that still wanted more. It was like being trapped in an addictive cycle, a trap I couldn't escape. And you? Have you ever felt like something invisible was trying to influence you? Have you ever had the feeling that you are being watched, even when you are alone? I want you to leave a comment if you have ever experienced something like this. Write, "I recognize this influence," or "I have felt this," because it is important to share these experiences. Perhaps what you have experienced can be the warning that someone else needs to hear. From the moment the demonstrations became frequent, I realized that something much bigger was happening. What once seemed like a harmless curiosity now turned into a constant weight in my life. I felt like I had crossed an invisible line, a point of no return. Something had changed, and it wasn't for the better. The nights were the worst. I had always been a person who valued the tranquility of nighttime silence, but now it became unbearable. It felt like the very environment of my home was alive, charged with a dense, heavy energy that seemed to whisper dark secrets that I didn't want to hear. There was one night in particular that had a profound impact on this period. I was lying down, trying to sleep, but I felt like something was wrong. It was as if the air was charged, and there was a pressure in the room, almost as if someone was there, standing in the corner of the room watching me. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to ignore the sensation, but then I heard a sound. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a light scratch on the wall. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or perhaps some common noise in the night, but the sound became louder, more persistent, until it seemed to be coming from everywhere. My breathing quickened, and I huddled under the covers like a scared child. I wanted to believe that all of this was a product of my mind. After all, how can you explain something so absurd? But at the same time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. When I finally mustered the courage to open my eyes, what I saw still haunts me to this day. In the corner of the room where the darkness seemed thickest, there was a shadow that didn't make sense. It was not projected by anything visible. It was as if it were there on its own, pulsing, almost alive. My heart raced and everything in me screamed to run away, but I was paralyzed, unable to move a muscle. This was not a simple sensation. It was real. I could feel his presence, his intent. There was no doubt that this was not benign. It was something that fed on my fear, that seemed to gain strength as I let myself be carried away by panic. I remember closing my eyes again and starting to mumble whatever prayer I could remember. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually the atmosphere seemed to get lighter and the shadow disappeared. But the fear remained. The feeling that something had been awakened, something I couldn't control, was more present than ever. Over the next few days, I tried to continue my routine as if nothing had happened, but things only got worse. Objects started disappearing and reappearing in different places. Pictures fell from the walls for no apparent reason, and doors opened and closed by themselves. But the worst thing was the constant feeling that I was never alone. Even in moments of apparent tranquility, I could feel an invisible gaze following me, as if something was waiting for the right moment to act. I started desperately researching what was going on. I spent sleepless nights reading about spiritual manifestations, possessions, and supernatural attacks. What scared me most was how often the experiences I read about coincided with what I was living. Many of the stories talked about how seemingly harmless practices, such as guided meditation, spiritual connection rituals, and even the use of symbolic objects, could open doors to entities that were anything but friendly. It was as if every line I read was a direct warning to me, but it was too late. At this point, I started to notice that my physical health was also being affected. I could barely sleep, and when I did, the nightmares were so intense that I woke up more tired than before. I felt inexplicable pain throughout my body, as if I had been carrying a huge weight. My appetite decreased and my energy seemed to be drained every day. People around me started to notice the changes. They said I looked paler, more distant, as if I always had something on my mind. Little did they know that I was, in fact, fighting, something that seemed to be slowly consuming me. What struck me most, however, was the feeling of impotence. I always believed I had control over my life, but now I realized I had no control at all. Every ritual, every practice that I had done with the intention of seeking answers had, in fact, led me into a web of lies and manipulation. I was like a puppet in the hands of something I couldn't see, but was clearly there. And then I started to question everything. Were the decisions I made really mine? Or was it that from the beginning I was being guided, manipulated by a force that presented itself as spiritual help, but that actually had very different intentions? The more I reflected, the clearer it became that I had been deceived. The occult was not just a practice or a hobby, it was a trap, a path carefully constructed to take me to where I was now, on the edge of a spiritual abyss. And you? Have you ever had an experience that seemed out of your control? Have you ever felt like something was influencing your choices in a subtle but constant way? If you've experienced something similar, share it in the comments. I want to know what you felt. Right, I've experienced this, or I know what it's like. Sometimes these stories can be the warning. Someone needs to avoid falling into the same trap. From the moment I started to question what was happening, things around me seemed to respond almost immediately. They were not direct answers, but events that made it clear that I was being observed, accompanied. It was as if the forces I had unwittingly invited were now revealing themselves, showing that they were unwilling to relinquish the control they'd gained over my life. It was no longer just a feeling or a suspicion. It was real. The supernatural had crossed the line into the physical world, and there was no longer any way to deny it or ignore it. It all started with manifestations that were previously subtle becoming impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched, which before was just uncomfortable, now became unbearable. It was as if I could feel the weight of the gaze of these presences in every corner of my house. Sometimes I would just sit, trying to distract myself with a book or the noise from the TV, and I would feel that pressure in the room. Looking into the corners of the room or down the dark hallways was a challenge because I knew deep down there was something there, something that shouldn't be. There was a night when I woke up with a feeling of intense cold. Even though I was under the covers, my entire body had goosebumps, as if something was draining all the energy around me. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the light from the lamp next to the bed was flickering erratically. It was as if electricity itself was being manipulated. I wanted to get up, turn on all the lights, but my body felt paralyzed. Then I heard something. It wasn't an ordinary sound, like footsteps or wind. It was something deeper, something that seemed to come from within the walls, like a low, continuous moan that resonated in the silence of the early morning. What scared me even more was how these manifestations were not limited to just the physical environment. They began to invade my thoughts, to interfere with my way of seeing the world. It was as if these forces knew exactly where to attack, how to exploit my doubts, my fears, my weaknesses. There were times when I found myself questioning my own sanity. Was I actually experiencing all of this? Or was my mind creating these experiences? A way of dealing with the chaos I had caused? But every time I tried to rationalize, something happened. It was as if these entities wanted to remind me that they were there, that this was real, and that I no longer had any control over my life. In a moment of desperation, I decided to seek help from a spiritualist group. They welcomed me with comforting words, saying that I was just going through a transformation process. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Every time I participated in some ritual or practice they suggested, things seemed to get worse. It was like throwing fuel on a fire that was already out of control. I remember a session where we were asked to close our eyes and connect with our higher energies. When I did this, I felt such strong pressure in my chest that it felt like something was trying to enter me. It was at that moment that I realized how dangerous it was to continue down this path. The nights became even more difficult. Nightmares were constant, but they weren't just ordinary dreams. They had a weight, an intensity that left marks even after waking up. I dreamed of places that seemed like something out of a horror movie, labyrinths of fire and shadows, grotesque figures that approached, whispers that echoed, words of hatred and destruction. And the most terrifying thing was the feeling that these dreams were not just creations of my mind. They felt more like visits to a real place, a place where the pain and despair were palpable. I remember a specific dream that left a deep impression on me. In it, I walked through a field covered in fog. As I moved forward, I realized that the ground was made of broken bones and the mist seemed to move alive, as if it were surrounding me. Then, a figure appeared in the distance. She wasn't human. His shape was distorted, impossible to describe accurately, but his eyes, they were like black, endless pits, and they seemed to suck me into them. I woke up screaming, with my heart racing, and realized there were red marks on my arms like scratches that I definitely hadn't made. After that, it became clear to me that I had completely lost control. I was no longer just messing around with supernatural forces. I had opened a door that I couldn't close, and now these forces were taking over my life, my body, my mind. Every day was a struggle to keep my sanity, to find some hope that this could come to an end. And you? Have you ever felt like your mind was being attacked? That your thoughts or dreams were being manipulated by something you couldn't explain? I want to know if you've had experiences like these. Write in the comments, "I know what it's like," or "I've felt this." Your stories can help others understand what is happening in their own lives. And together we can bring these truths to light. After that night, when I woke up with marks on my body and the feeling of having been dragged to some place where despair was infinite, I realized that the situation had reached a critical point. It was no longer a matter of spiritual discomfort or strange coincidences. I was immersed in a cycle of torment that seemed to intensify every day. The feeling that something invisible was chasing me was constant, and even the few hours of sleep I managed were invaded by nightmares so real that they left traces in my body and mind. The days began to blend together, as if time had completely lost its meaning. I felt drained, without energy, as if every moment these forces were draining the vitality I still had left. And yet, something kept me from stopping. There was a part of me that was completely wrapped up in this, as if I had become dependent on the practices that initially promised me control and enlightenment. It was like a web that held me, keeping me trapped as I tried in vain to free myself. The demonstrations continued to intensify. Objects at home not only moved or fell, but seemed to respond to certain actions of mine, as if they were reacting to my emotions or thoughts. Once, as I opened a cupboard in the kitchen, I felt a gust of cold wind pass by me. There were no windows, open, no fans on, just that cold that seemed to come from inside the closet, as if something was hiding there, waiting. And that was just the beginning. The most terrifying moment happened late in the afternoon. I was in the bathroom, looking in the mirror, trying to convince myself that everything was a figment of my imagination. I struggled to take deep breaths, trying to find some normalcy amidst the chaos. But as I stared at my reflection, I saw something. That made my heart skip a beat. For a brief moment, the reflection in the mirror didn't look like mine. It was as if a shadow had taken over my image, distorting my face in a subtle but clearly noticeable way. I recoiled instantly, but I couldn't look away. That shadow seemed to laugh, to mock, and for a moment I thought it was going to come out of the mirror. That experience shook me so much that I couldn't even go into the bathroom without leaving all the lights in the house on. I began to realize that even though everything seemed to be falling apart around me, there was something inside me that was still holding on. I knew I needed help, but the question was, where to get it? The spiritualist groups I attended only seemed to worsen the situation, as if they were feeding the forces that tormented me. I tried to isolate myself, stop participating in rituals, stopping connecting with those practices, but it seemed too late. It was as if these entities already had direct access to me, and even silence did not keep them away. One night, while trying to sleep, I was awakened by an overwhelming feeling of heaviness in my chest. I couldn't breathe properly. My body felt trapped, as if something was immobilizing me. And then I heard those whispers again, but this time they were louder, clearer. They repeated my name, called me, teased me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was caught in my throat, and the only sound that came out was a soft moan of despair. When I was finally able to move, I ran to turn on all the lights in the house. I sat in the living room, my heart beating wildly, trying to understand what had happened. I knew I was dealing with something much bigger than myself. This was not just a consequence of my choices, but an invasion of forces that I should never have allowed to enter my life. There was no longer any doubt. I had crossed a border that should never have been crossed. And the price of this was proving increasingly cruel. I felt like my soul was being pulled, that more and more parts of me were being taken over by this darkness. I started to question every decision I made, every moment that led up to this. I thought about how it all seemed so harmless at first, how I let myself be seduced by something that promised answers and clarity, but was actually leading me into a spiritual abyss. With each new experience, I understood that the supernatural was not just a field of curiosity. He was real, tangible, and far more dangerous than any ordinary person could imagine. And now I ask you who are here with me. Have you ever felt that something bigger, invisible, was trying to control your life? Have you ever felt like your own choices were being influenced by something you couldn't understand? I want you to share in the comments because it's important to give voice to these experiences. If you've been through something like this, write, "I feel this weight," or "I experienced this too." Sharing these stories can be the first step to understanding, and more importantly, seeking liberation. The more I tried to understand what was happening, the more I realized there was something much bigger behind it all. Occultism, which at first seemed like a simple search for answers and self-knowledge, showed its true face, a carefully disguised trap. Each ritual, each practice, each revelation that was promised to me was like an attractive bait, which pulled me deeper and deeper into a darkness of no return. What once seemed fascinating now revealed itself as a dangerous path, paved by deceptions that had only one objective: to imprison me. I began to understand that the occult is not just a set of practices, but an open door, a door that, once unlocked, allows forces that are beyond our understanding to enter our lives without asking permission. They are not neutral energies. They are not harmless cosmic vibrations. They are real spiritual forces, which know exactly how to manipulate our emotions, our desires, and even our deepest fears. In my case, these forces used my curiosity and thirst for control to draw me in. They disguised themselves as self-knowledge and power, but what they delivered was spiritual torment and slavery. It's scary to realize how normalized these practices are in today's world. They are everywhere, in films, series, books, even in applications that promise energetic alignment. They are sold as tools to improve your life, to help you find yourself. But what no one tells you is that, when you engage in these practices, you are not just playing with something unknown. You are, in fact, giving a piece of yourself to forces that are anything but benign. I remember a specific day when I finally started to see what was happening. I was researching some practices I had started doing, trying to understand why things were getting so out of control. It was then that I found something that described exactly what I was experiencing: the concept of open spiritual doors. Basically, these doors are created by actions, decisions, and even thoughts that invite spiritual forces into your life. This can happen through seemingly harmless practices, such as guided meditations, tarot readings, invocations, or even searching for signs in the supernatural. The moment I read this, something clicked inside me. Everything made sense. Every ritual, every meditation, every attempt at connection I had made was actually a way of opening these doors. And the scary thing is that once these doors are opened, they cannot be closed easily. The forces that cross into your world don't leave just because you decide to stop. They attach themselves to you, feed on you, and only stop tormenting you if they are expelled. The more I read, the clearer it became that the occult is not something you can control. You may think you're in charge, but in reality, you're just a pawn in a much bigger game. These C practices create a false sense of power, as if you are in control of your destiny. But what they really do is put you in the hands of something that wants to destroy you. And that's no exaggeration. I experienced this firsthand. After understanding this concept of open spiritual doors, I began to reflect on everything I'd done. Every little ritual, every word recited, every symbol I carried, everything was like a key I had used to open these doors. And at the same time, each of these acts was an invitation for these forces to enter my life. I had no idea what I was allowing, but now it was impossible to ignore. I remember one night in particular when I finally understood the weight of what I had done. I was reviewing some objects that I had accumulated during my journey into the occult: crystals, tarot cards, books on spiritual practices. I held these items in my hands and felt as if they were carrying a physical weight. They weren't just objects. They seemed to pulse with an energy that I couldn't describe, but that I knew wasn't good. As I held them, I felt pressure in my chest, as if something wanted to stop me from thinking clearly. It was at that moment that I realized I needed to do something. I could no longer ignore the fact that I had gotten involved in something that was far beyond what I could handle. And perhaps the scariest thing was realizing that I was never truly in control. Every step I thought I was taking on my own was actually guided by these forces. They pulled me, manipulated me, convinced me that I was making the decisions, but it was all part of their plan to arrest me. And now, as I share this with you, I want you to reflect on the choices you have made. Have you ever been involved in something that seemed harmless, but then realized there was more to it? Have you ever felt like you were being carried away by something that seemed beyond your control? If you've been through something like this, leave in the comments, "I've already opened these doors," or "I recognize this." Your words can be the help someone else needs to understand what they are experiencing. Let's talk about this, because the more light we put on these matters, the less room there will be for darkness. After understanding the gravity of what I had done and the weight of the spiritual doors I had opened for myself, I began to realize that what I was experiencing went far beyond strange phenomena or uncomfortable sensations. It was something real, tangible, that had a very clear intention: to destroy me. These forces didn't just want to torment my mind or mess with my thoughts. They wanted my soul. It was at this moment that the visions began to intensify, and what I am going to share now is not something that I am proud to have experienced, but something that I feel is necessary to tell. The first visions appeared as nightmares, but soon became something deeper. They happened when I was sleeping, but they weren't like normal dreams. It was as if my mind was taken to a place that didn't belong in this world. The scariest thing was the clarity. They were not confusing or fragmented images like in common dreams. Everything was clear, as if I were really there, seeing and feeling every detail. I remember the first vision with absolute precision. I was in a place that looked like a desert, but the floor wasn't made of sand. It was composed of something dark, like ash mixed with coal. The air was heavy, suffocating, and there was a smell of sulfur so strong it seemed caustic in my throat. In the distance, I could hear screams, not screams of physical pain, but something much deeper, as if each scream carried the weight of eternal torment. As I walked, I noticed that the sky above me was a reddish hue, as if it were on fire. There was no sun, just an oppressive glare that seemed to come from everywhere. In front of me, I began to see figures. They weren't human, but they also didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. Their shapes were distorted, grotesque, as if each one was a reflection of the pain and evil they carried. His eyes, if you could call them that, shone with a hatred that chilled me to the bone. These figures did not speak, but I could hear their intentions clearly, as if their words were being whispered directly into my mind. They mocked me, saying that I had chosen to Bether, that it was all the result of my own decisions. One of them approached, extending a skeletal hand toward me. I felt a cold so intense that it seemed to cut my skin. I tried to step back, but my feet were trapped, as if the ground had closed in around me. When I woke up, I was sweating, my breathing was rapid, but the scariest thing was the feeling that I hadn't really woken up. The smell of sulfur was still in the air, and for a moment, I thought I had brought something from that vision with me. From that day on, the visions became more frequent, and each one seemed to be more intense and more disturbing than the last. In one of the most memorable experiences, I was taken to a place that felt like a prison, but was not like any earthly prison. The cells were made of darkness, not bars or walls. Inside each one, I could see shadows writhing, crying out for help, but their voices were muffled by a kind of oppressive silence. As I walked through that place, I heard a voice that didn't come from any of the trapped figures. It was a powerful, deep voice that seemed to reverberate throughout the room. She told me, "Here are those who opened their lives to darkness and never turned to the light. This is the fate of those who choose to reject the truth." Those words stuck in my mind because at that moment I knew that what was being shown was more than a vision. It was a message, a warning. I realized that I was not just being tormented by these forces, but that I was being confronted with the reality of what lies on the other side. Everything I thought I knew about the spiritual world, all the beliefs I had about the supernatural, were destroyed by these experiences. Hell was not just a distant concept or symbolic idea. He was real, and I was seeing it with my own eyes. These visions were not only terrifying, they were transformative. Every time I woke up, I felt like I had come back from a battle, like I was carrying invisible marks of what I had faced. But at the same time, something inside me began to change. I knew I needed to do something to get out of that situation. I could not continue allowing these forces to have access to my life. And now I ask you, have you ever had an experience that made you question everything you believed in? Have you ever seen or felt something that seemed bigger than this world, something that you couldn't explain? If so, share in the comments. Write, "I believe in what I saw," or "I've been there too." Your words may be just what someone else needs to understand that they are not alone. Let's bring these stories to light, because it is in recognizing the truth that we begin to free ourselves from the darkness. After so many nights of being consumed by fear and despair, something inside me began to change. It wasn't just the weight of experiences, views, and feelings of oppression that I carried. It was as if, deep within my being, a weak flame was still burning, resisting, even in the midst of the darkness that enveloped me. Despite everything I'd already experienced, that little spark made me believe that maybe there was still a way out, even if I didn't know where to find it. And it was in one of the deepest moments of agony that this light began to manifest in a way I could never have imagined. It was an ordinary night, or at least it seemed to be. I felt completely exhausted, both physically and spiritually. The oppression at home was almost palpable, and the feeling that something was lurking around every corner was so constant that I no longer knew what peace was. But that night, something was different. After weeks of not praying or seeking any connection with God, because honestly, I didn't believe He would be listening to me, I found myself on my knees without even knowing why. I had no words to say, I didn't know how to start, but at that moment, I just cried. I remember saying just one sentence, almost a whisper. "God, if you exist, please help me." It was a plea so simple, so filled with pain and regret, that it seemed to have come from the deepest part of my soul. I didn't expect anything. I was already used to being ignored by the spiritual world that, until then, only seemed to manifest itself to torment me. But what happened next was something that completely transformed my life. As I was there, kneeling, I felt something I had never felt before. It was as if a wave of heat enveloped me, but it wasn't physical heat. It was a heat that seemed to come from within, as if it was reaching the coldest, darkest place in my soul. At the same time, an indescribable peace began to wash over me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was so strong, so real, that it made me stop crying. There was no more fear, no more weight. It was as if, for a moment, all the torment had been suspended, as if light had finally invaded the place where I was. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but inside my mind and my heart. A calm, steady, loving voice that simply said, "I am here." It was as if those words were engraved on me, echoing and filling every part of the emptiness I felt. I knew in that instant that I was not alone. For the first time in so long, I felt the presence of God. It was not a vague or imaginary sensation. It was something so tangible that I couldn't deny it even if I wanted to. The most impressive thing is that throughout that night, I began to realize that this presence was leading me. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding me, helping me see everything differently. For the first time, I understood that the forces that tormented me did not have absolute power over me. They had only managed to enter my life because I allowed them, because I opened doors that should never have been opened. But now, with God on my side, I realized that those doors could also be closed. Over the following weeks, this experience began to intensify. It wasn't easy, because the forces that were present in my life didn't give up so easily. They fought, they spoke out, they tried to pull me back, but now something had changed. I was no longer facing everything alone. Every time I felt fear or the overwhelm returned, I would remember that night and say out loud, "I know God is with me. You no longer have power over me." It was in this process that I began to understand the power of prayer. Before, I saw prayer as a formality, something you did out of habit or obligation. But now, it has become my most powerful weapon. Each prayer was like a cry of resistance, a declaration that I no longer belonged to that darkness. Little by little, the demonstrations began to subside. The peace I felt during prayers began to expand, taking over me and the environment around me. I also began to reconnect with God's word, something I had neglected for so long. Each verse I read seemed to be a direct answer to my doubts and fears, as if God was speaking to me through every word, showing me that He was always there, just waiting for me to seek Him. And now, as I tell you this, I want you to know that this light is not reserved just for me. God is within reach of all who seek Him, no matter how far you have gone or how lost you feel. We want you to reflect. Have you ever had a moment when you felt a presence of peace in the midst of chaos? Have you ever felt like something bigger was watching over you, even when it seemed like everything was lost? If so, share in the comments. Write, "I felt the presence of God," or "I believe in this light." Your words could be the beginning of a healing process for you or someone reading this right now. Let's bring more light to the world, together. After that night when I felt God's presence for the first time in years, something inside me began to change profoundly. It was as if the light that had touched my soul was beginning to grow, to illuminate every dark corner I carried. But I knew this would only be the beginning. There were still many open wounds, many marks left by the choices I made, and the doors I myself allowed to be opened. The liberation process was not immediate. It came with a lot of struggle, with falls, with doubts, but also with a growing certainty that God was with me, that I would no longer face darkness alone. In the first few days after that experience, I still felt the weight of spiritual oppression. The demonstrations that were so intense before were still happening, but now there was something different. I knew I didn't need to be afraid. Even as I felt the presence of those forces around me, I could now face them with prayer and with the authority God was teaching me to exercise. The first time I was faced with this situation, it was scary. The feeling that something dark was in my room returned, and the initial instinct was the same as always: fear and paralysis. But this time, instead of cowering or trying to ignore it, I stood up, closed my eyes, and began to pray. At first, my words were hesitant, but as I prayed, I felt a strength that was not mine. I can't explain it any other way. It was as if God was literally at my side, strengthening me, giving me the right words. I ordered that presence to leave my house, and for the first time, I felt that something had changed. The air, which had previously felt so heavy, became light. The silence that came after was not the oppressive silence of before, but a silence of peace, of victory. At that moment, I realized that prayer was not just a tool for connecting with God. She was a powerful weapon against any force that tried to imprison me again. But the liberation process also demanded something much more difficult from me, facing the choices that led me there and starting to undo each one of them. I knew it wasn't enough to just pray or ask for forgiveness. It was necessary to take concrete actions to close the doors that I had opened. I started with the objects that were still in my house, souvenirs of the occult practices that I had adopted. There were crystals, letters, books, and other items that I had previously seen as harmless, but that I now understood were symbols of a spiritual connection that needed to be severed. I remember the moment I gathered all of that in a box. It was one of the most difficult steps, because each object seemed to carry its own resistance, as if it were fighting to stay there. But with determination and prayer, I took that box to the backyard and set everything on fire. As I watched the flames consume those items, I felt as if some of the weight I was carrying was being destroyed along with them. It wasn't easy. There was a part of me that still questioned whether all of this was really necessary, whether I was overreacting. But at the same time, something inside me knew it was the right step to take. The next step was to reconnect with the Word of God. In the beginning, it was difficult. Every time I opened the Bible, I felt a blockage, as if my mind couldn't focus. But little by little, I persisted, reading verse by verse, trying to understand what God was showing me. One of the passages that struck me most was, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. That phrase became an anchor for me, a constant reminder that the freedom I sought could only be found in God's truth, not in the lies the occult had offered me. I also started seeking spiritual help. I found people who supported me, who prayed with me, and taught me more about how to strengthen my faith. It was during this period that I realized that liberation was not just an isolated act, but an ongoing process of transformation. Each day was an opportunity to draw closer to God, to replace fear with trust, pain with peace, and darkness with light. One of the hardest parts of this process was dealing with the emotional scars that remained. The experiences I lived left deep scars, and there were days when I still felt vulnerable, as if I could fall into the same traps again. But in those moments, God always reminded me that I didn't have to fight alone. He was with me, guiding me, strengthening me, and showing me that even in moments of weakness, His grace was sufficient. Today, looking back, I see that each step in this liberation process was essential. It wasn't easy, and maybe it never will be. But every prayer, every choice to let go of practices that kept me from God, every time I chose to trust rather than fear, was a step toward complete healing. And this healing was not just spiritual, but also emotional, mental, and physical. God was restoring every area of my life. And you? Have you ever felt like you needed to break free from something that was holding you back, but didn't know where to start? Have you ever had the feeling that the only way out was to take a step of faith, even though you weren't sure where it would take you? I want you to share in the comments. Write, "I want liberation," or "I have experienced something similar." Your words can be the beginning of a healing process, not only for you, but also for whoever is reading. Let's share these stories and strengthen each other. Over time, as I walked through the process of liberation and healing, I began to see more clearly the subtle strategies that had caused me to fall so deeply into the traps of the occult. It all seemed so simple at first, so attractive, and that's exactly how it works. The darkness does not present itself with screams or obvious threats. They come disguised as light, ask-quick solutions, as answers to the deepest questions of our soul. This is why so many people fall without realizing that they are being drawn into something that can destroy not only their lives, but also their souls. Spiritual traps don't appear suddenly, and that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. They start subtly, with small choices that seem harmless. A casual interest in astrology, reading a horoscope, a ritual to attract good energy. These are steps that, alone, don't seem to mean much, but together they open spiritual doors that should never be opened. In my case, it was exactly like that. It started with curiosity, a search for something beyond the obvious, and before I knew it, I was immersed in practices that took me completely away from the truth. What strikes me most is how normal these practices have become. Nowadays, it's difficult to turn on the TV, open social media, or even watch a movie without finding some mention of occult concepts disguised as something innocent. Words like energy, universe, spirituality are used so frequently that they seem harmless, but they carry deep and often dangerous meanings. I'm not saying that anyone who mentions these concepts is involved in something evil, but You need to be aware of what's really behind it. The problem is not in the interest in the spiritual, but in the source of that interest. The question everyone should ask is, where does this practice come from? Who is she connected to? Many people think they can explore these things without committing. They tell themselves that they are in control, that they know how far they can go. But the truth is that control is exactly what you lose when you get involved with the occult. It is an illusion to believe that we can play with the supernatural without consequences. The forces operating in this world are not neutral, and any gap you make will be used against you. There is no neutrality in the spiritual field. You are connecting with the light or the dark. There is no middle ground. One of the biggest spiritual traps is a false sense of power. At first, these practices make you feel in control, like you're discovering a secret that no one else knows. That's exactly what happened to me. I believed I was in charge, that the choices I was making were taking me to a place of greater knowledge and freedom. But in reality, all I was doing was moving away from God and getting deeper and deeper into a web of deception. The forces I thought I was manipulating were actually those that were manipulating me. I want to make a clear warning to you who are watching this video. If there is something in your life that resembles these practices, be it astrology, rituals, meditations, that involve invocations or even the use of objects that promise to bring protection or luck, it is time to stop and reflect. These things are not harmless. They carry a spiritual weight that you may not be able to see right away, but that is working against you. It's like opening a door and allowing something to enter without even knowing who or what is on the other side. Have you ever noticed how these practices are linked to a constant search for answers? It's as if there was always one more card to turn over, one more ritual to do, one more step to reach. This happens because these forces want to keep you trapped. They will never give you the answers you are really looking for, because the goal is not to free you, but to enslave you. This is one of the biggest lies of the occult, the idea that it can give you peace or control. But true peace, real freedom, can only be found in God. The message I want to leave is clear. Do not underestimate these spiritual traps. They may seem harmless, even attractive, but the price to be paid is much greater than you imagine. What starts as curiosity can turn into torment, as it happened to me. And the further you go, the harder it is to find your way back. But there's good news. No matter how far you've gone, there's always a chance to return. God is always ready to welcome those who seek Him, to restore what has been destroyed, and to bring light where there was once darkness. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were being drawn to something that seemed innocent, but then turned out to have more weight than you imagined? Have you ever had doubts about practices or beliefs that seemed modern or acceptable, but that deep down caused concern? If so, I want you to share it in the comments. Right, I have already seen these traps, or I want to avoid these loopholes. Let's talk about it, because sharing these experiences can be the first step in helping someone recognize the dangers and choose the right path. Together, we can expose the truth and help more people avoid spiritual traps. If you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. Something bigger is at work in your life right now, and it's impossible to ignore how God uses the right circumstances to touch our hearts. We want to know how this message spoke to you. How did she stir your soul? What part of this story awakened something in you that had perhaps been dormant? Comment below. I felt God's voice in this video, because I believe that by sharing, you can not only be confirming what God is doing in your life, but also helping other people who are reading the comments and perhaps need this same transformation. If this message has brought you clarity, comfort, or even a spiritual awakening, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel now to continue receiving content that can transform your journey. This mission is about bringing light to darkness, about opening your eyes to truths that are often ignored. Every subscription, every like, and every comment is part of this journey to reach more hearts that need to hear what you heard today. Leave your like to help us get this message to more people. The simple gesture of liking strengthens this mission of spreading what really matters, reaching lives that are looking for answers, peace, and a true connection with God. Remember to activate the notification bell, because with each new video, you will be closer to a new revelation that can change the way you see the spiritual world and your journey of faith. And, of course, be sure to watch the next video, which is already here on the final screen. It is a continuation of this journey and brings even more reflections and truths that can impact your life in ways you can't even imagine. God is working in your life, and every step you take toward Him is an opportunity to grow, to break free, and to get closer to the purpose for which you were created. May God bless your life powerfully. May He guide your steps, enlighten your mind, and strengthen your faith. And may you never forget, no matter how distant you may have felt, God is always close, ready to welcome you, restore you, and lead you to a new beginning. I'll wait for you in the next video. Until then.